So this is an interesting topic because Mexicans were defined as white by treaty under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo after the Mexican-American War, because at the time only Africans and white people could become citizens of the U.S. So this was just basically implied because the law only allowed those two groups, and Mexicans obviously were not like defined as that. But because they were going to be given citizenship after the war if they chose to remain on American soil, well, the newly won American soil at the time, instead of going back to Mexico or declaring themselves Mexican citizens, this was implied that they were white by treaty. Following this, there were legal battles. For example, in 1897, there was Rodriguez who was trying to get his citizenship in Texas, but he had to go to court over it because there was opposition to this. At the time, again, they just referenced the fact that only white people and Africans could get citizenship and that he was not from either race. He ended up winning the case. The judge ruled in his favor, citing the 14th Amendment, and that regardless of origin or race, you could obtain American citizenship. But this case served to only reinforce the Treaty of Guadalupe in defining Mexicans as legally white for a lot of legal purposes. And this is just literally some actual dialogue from 1897 where he was being questioned by the opposition, where they were asking him, do you belong to the Aztec race of Mexico? And he said, no. Do you belong to the race of Spain? And he said, no. What race? And he said, I don't know. So again, this all goes all the way back to over a century. But yeah, nowadays, this is pretty outdated. There's no need for this to be the case for Mexicans to be legally white, but it's still, or Latinos or Hispanics in general, but it's there, honestly, unless like we change it or we identify something else, because now you have the ability to. But a lot of times, I used to work for a police department. On the reports, we would always default Latinos or Hispanics as being of the white race automatically. And of course, this has the basis on well over a century ago as to why we do that. But nowadays, you have the freedom to identify the actual correct race that a lot of Mexicans or Latinos would be. So you could actually identify as American Indian if you'd like, or both, or whatever the hell you want. But now you have that freedom. That's the whole point of that. In the past, this designation was very necessary because times were different. And so it was a victory back then for Mexicans to be defined as legally white, because that's the only way they would have rights.
So I tend to get comments like this about how Mexicans were white historically and how they were given access to all kinds of privileges, which is true to an extent. Now, if you're not familiar with our history, Mexicans were considered white on paper since about 1848. Those of Mexican descent were included and excluded from white institutions or white spaces such as parks, schools, theaters, restrooms, restaurants, pools, etc. But to understand Mexican American history in the 19th and 20th century, you have to understand the complexity of whiteness. So just because Mexicanos and Mexicanas fell under this legal white umbrella doesn't mean they were always viewed as the right kind of white. So what do I mean by that? Well, you have to understand, again, the complexity of whiteness, and that there is this historical notion that there were many white races in the 19th and early 20th century, with the Anglo-Saxon being at the top, and other white races being seen as inferior, whether, for instance, like the Italians or the Irish. So understanding that there were many white races is something that can help us to make sense of why, when a Mexican entered a white institution, they could have still been othered, and why it's important to not just fall in line with this simplistic idea that, hey, well, they were put on the white side of the color line legally, so that means they were seen as white in general. Not true. To understand this idea of many white races, I would recommend that you read The History of White People by Dr. Nell Irvin Painter. And I'll leave this video with a small clip from Dr. Painter, who explains it best.
So now we assume that there's one big white race, and it's on a toggle switch. Either you're in it or you're out. That was not the case. That was not earlier the case. So in the 19th century, a thinker like Ralph Waldo Emerson could very easily see that there were several white races. This was commonplace in science. There were several white races. The ones at the top were called Teutonic or Saxon or Anglo-Saxon Ralph Waldo Emerson thought of himself as a Saxon. And then there were other white races, like the Celtic race. Because remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson lived at the time of heavy, impoverished immigration from Ireland. The Irish immigrants of Emerson's time were very poor, dirty, ignorant people. So therefore, they belonged to an inferior race. And then at the turn of the 20th century, there was the Eastern European Hebrew race. There was the Northern Italian race. There was the Southern Italian race. There were all these white races, many, 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 many white races. And then the non-whites were lumped into big categories like Chinese or Negro. So unless they were in special places like Louisiana, Negro or Chinese was not disaggregated. So poor Catholic Irishmen were definitely white. Poor Italian Neapolitan immigrants were definitely white. They just belonged to inferior white races. That was the thinking in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. They were definitely white. They belonged to inferior white race as plural.